Friends, in today's video we are going to discuss what is meant by systemically important banks and why some banks are classified as DSIBs or domestic systemically important banks. The Reserve Bank of India on 19th January 2021 said that State Bank of India, Icici Bank and Hdfc Bank will continue to be identified as domestic systemically important banks or DSIBs. These banks have been identified as DSIBs as per the RBI's DSIB framework issued on July 22, 2014. The DSIB framework requires the Reserve Bank to disclose the names of banks designated as DSIBs starting from 2015. So in this video we will see what is meant by systemically important banks and what is the significance and implications of such a classification. DSIB means that the bank is too big to fail. According to the RBI, some banks become systemically important due to their size, cross-jurisdictional activities, complexity, lack of substitute and interconnection. Generally, banks whose assets exceed 2% of GDP are considered for classification as DSIBs. There are two types of systemically important banks. One is global systemically important banks or GSIBs. These banks, that is global systemically important banks, are of importance to the whole world. These are selected by Financial Stability Board or FSB in consultation with the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, that is BCBS. Every year in November, FSB releases the list of GSIBs. Total number of GSIBs at present is 30. Some of the global systemically important banks are JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo Bank and China Construction Bank. The second type is domestic systemically important banks or DSIBs. These are the banks that are important to a particular country. Such banks are selected by the central bank of that country. Now coming to the domestic systemically important banks or DSIBs in India. Being the central bank in India, the Reserve Bank of India carries out the task of selecting the DSIBs in the country. RBI uses the BCBS methodology for identifying the DSIBs. The first condition is that a bank having a size of more than 2% of GDP can be selected as DSIB. The selection of a bank as DSIB by RBI is based on four indicators. These are the size, interconnectedness, substitutability and financial institution infrastructure, which includes considerations related to the concentrated nature of the banking sector and also complexity. Complexity also includes additional complexities from cross-border activities. Now the background of classifying banks as systemically important. The concept of DSIB actually emerged after the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. It was observed during the global financial crisis that problems faced by certain large and highly interconnected financial institutions hampered the orderly functioning of the financial system, which in turn negatively impacted the real economy. Also, government intervention was considered necessary to ensure financial stability in many jurisdictions. Cost of public sector intervention and the resultant increase in moral hazard required that future regulatory policies should aim at reducing the probability of failure of SIBs and the impact of the failure of these banks. Then, what is the significance of these type of classifications? Should such a bank fail, that is, in the event of failure of such a big bank, there would be significant disruption not only to the essential services they provide to the banking system, but also to the overall economy. Similarly, the too big to fail tag means that in case of distress, the government is expected to support these banks. Due to this perception, these banks enjoy certain advantages in funding. It also means that these banks have a different set of policy measures regarding systemic risk and moral hazard issues. What do you mean by systemic risk and moral hazard issues here? Systemic risk is the possibility that an event at the company level could trigger severe instability or even collapse of an entire industry or economy. Whereas Moral hazard is an idea that a party protected from risk in some way will act differently than if they didn't have that protection. For example, when banks, which are considered as too big to fail, take additional financial risk knowing well that they will be bailed out by the government in the event of any problems, is a kind of moral hazard. Then the DSIB framework requires the Reserve Bank to disclose the names of banks designated as DSIBs starting from 2015 and place them in appropriate buckets depending upon their systemic importance scores or SAS. Based on the buckets in which a DSIB is placed, an additional common equity requirement has also to be applied to it. Based on the methodology provided in the DSIB framework and data collected from banks as on March 31st, 2015, State Bank of India was classified as a DSIB in 2015. Similarly, based on data collected in 2016, that is 2016 March, Icici Bank was also classified as a DSIB in August 2016. After that, based on data collected from banks as on March 31st, 2017 and March 31st, 2018, the Reserve Bank announced State Bank of India, ICICI Bank and also Hdfc Bank Limited as DSIBs on September 4, 2017 and March 14, 2019 respectively. The current update announced on 19th January 2021 is based on the data collected from banks as on March 31st, 2020. RBI also classifies the banks under 5 buckets depending on order of importance. ICICI Bank and HDFC Bank are in bucket 1 while SBI falls in bucket 3. All the banks under DSIB are required to maintain higher share of risk-weighted assets as Tier 1 equity. Accordingly, as part of DSIB framework, these 3 banks have been prescribed additional common equity Tier 1, that is CET1 requirement, as a percentage of their risk-weighted assets. The additional CET1 requirement is in addition to the capital conservation buffer, that is CCB. In the case of SBI, the additional CET1 requirement has been prescribed at 0.60% of its risk-weighted assets. Similarly, in the case of ICICI Bank and HDFC Bank, the additional CET1 requirement has been prescribed at 0.20% of their respective risk-weighted assets. The additional common equity Tier 1, that is CET1 requirement for DSIBs was phased in from April 1st, 2016 and became fully effective from April 1st, 2019. So, this is the background in which SBI, ICICI Bank and HDFC Bank have been retained as domestic systemically important banks by Reserve Bank of India. Thank you.